Welcome to DLS's Student Webinar Series. In this webinar, we'll talk about why listening is so hard. Language learners frequently rate listening as the most difficult of the four skills. Let's look at a few reasons why listening is so difficult. First, listening takes place in real time. When you're reading a text, you can slow down, or you can go back and reread something, or you can stop and look up a word. It's much harder to do these things when you're listening. Often, when you're listening to a foreign language, it can all sound like one long word. People don't always stop in between words or have pauses at the end of sentences. And often, people don't even speak in complete sentences. Because of this, it can be very difficult to identify word boundaries and to recognize words. Sometimes you might know a word in a foreign language, but you might not hear it when it's spoken in fluent or rapid speech. Another reason why listening is difficult is because teachers themselves can struggle to help learners build this skill. It can be difficult to break down the micro skills and help the students become better listeners. Finally, listener anxiety is a major factor in why listening is such a challenge. In this webinar, we'll look at three main ideas. One is processing skills. We'll go into some background information on what happens in our brains when we listen and how we process the speech that we hear. Second, we'll talk about setting realistic goals for your proficiency level. And then finally, we'll move into some tactics and practical activities that you can try for improving your listening comprehension. Listening is sometimes called the hidden skill because we can't see what happens when someone's listening. In order to understand why listening is so hard and how we can improve, let's start by looking at the basics of how our brains process what we hear. There are three steps or stages in our brain to process what we hear. The first is sensory memory. That's when we hear the sound. This immediately goes into the short-term memory, which is also called the working memory. And this is where the sound is processed for meaning. If the brain successfully decodes the message, then the information is sent into long-term memory. So the working memory is where this decoding process goes on. Many processes are working at once here. The brain is working to match sound to words, to assign meaning to the message. If the brain is successful in doing this, then the information goes to the long-term memory. So let's take a closer look at our processing skills, how we understand what we hear and process it for meaning. This is a complex process, as we saw in the previous slide, but second language researchers often talk about two main processing skills here, top-down and bottom-up. Let's look at what these skills mean. Top-down processing is when we use content knowledge and context to predict and identify meaning. For example, before listening to a news story, you might read the headline and think about what you already know and predict what the story is going to be about. This is activating your top-down processing skills. Bottom-up processing, on the other hand, is listening to each sound and building up into words, phrases, and meaning. For example, if you're in your classroom and filling in the gaps in a transcript, that's an exercise that focuses on bottom-up processing. Let's look at some examples of top-down and bottom-up processing at work in real life. Look at the pictures on the left. The woman in the top picture is listening to a friend talk about their day. She's mostly focused on following the main points in the story and reacting when needed. She's relying a lot on her top-down processing skills. She's only trying to follow the main ideas, and she already has a lot of background knowledge. The woman in the flower shop, however, is taking an order. She has to listen carefully for exactly what the speaker is saying. The exact words and sounds are really important. She is relying on her bottom-up processing skills. Now, in real life, both of these skills work together to help us understand what we hear. When we want to practice and improve our listening skills in a second language, it can often be helpful to focus on one skill at a time. Now that we've looked at what's involved in the skill of listening, let's look at some ways to improve our listening skills. First, to set macro or overall goals, it's a good idea to familiarize yourself with the ILR level descriptors for listening. These are available online and will help you to set realistic goals for your proficiency level. They can also help you identify what you need to work on to get to the next level. It's very important to be realistic when setting goals for yourself. You will not understand everything immediately when you're listening in a second language. That's just not the nature of how listening works. Listening is a marathon, not a sprint. In addition to setting macro goals or overall goals for your listening progress, it's also a good idea to set micro goals or comprehension goals for when you actually sit down to listen to something. So you don't want to just listen. Instead, you want to set yourself achievable tasks and goals. For example, let's say you sit down to listen to a 2-minute news segment in your target language. Your goal might be to listen and identify the places or the topics or the people that were mentioned. Or it might be to write down 5 key words that you hear. After listening once, you might listen again with a different goal. For example, to identify details about the topics you heard the first time. Finally, you might listen a third time and write down new vocabulary that you hear. Setting micro goals for your comprehension will also help you build your processing skills. For example, goals like listening to a news segment and identifying the main topics will build your top-down processing skills. Listening again to identify details will help build your bottom-up processing skills. Another strategy for improving listening is to identify and diagnose what's causing you problems. After you have finished a listening activity, perhaps having listened several times, take a moment and consider what made that particular listening difficult for you. Was it vocabulary? Perhaps you didn't know a word, or perhaps you knew the word, but you didn't recognize the pronunciation. Accent or speed can also cause problems. Or it might be background knowledge, cultural or regional knowledge that you haven't learned about yet. Checking a transcript can help you specifically identify what's causing you trouble. This step of reflecting and evaluating is a crucial part of building your listening skills. When you're interacting with a speaker of your target language, it's important to be an active listener. Ask someone to pause, to clarify, to repeat, or to slow down. Make sure you know how to ask for all of these things in the target language. If you're currently taking a class, listening to your teacher provides excellent practice for you. Make sure to maximize this practice by encouraging your teacher to speak in the target language as much as possible. It can be helpful to take a few minutes to talk with your teacher, maybe in English, about English use in the classroom and agree on some ground rules. For example, you might ask your teacher to repeat something in the target language 2 or 3 times before they translate to English. Finally, building your vocabulary can have a big impact on your listening. When you're listening, try not to get stuck when you hear a word that you don't know. But once that listening activity or experience is finished, it's a good idea to look up unfamiliar vocabulary afterwards. Building your vocabulary will improve your listening, but make sure that you know the pronunciation of the new words that you learn. You can use the pronunciation feature in a dictionary to help familiarize yourself with how words sound when they're pronounced. Now, let's look at a couple of listening activities you can do on your own to improve your listening. One is keeping a listening journal. This is an example of a template you might use. You can find this template from the source listed on the slide here. You can see that this template allows you to set comprehension goals, allows different types of listening for main ideas and specific details, and allows you to record new vocabulary. Here's a list from the Center for Applied Linguistics. These are listening activities you can do at home or in class with the support of a teacher. Feel free to pause the video here and take a screenshot of the activities, or you can find the original through the source listed at the bottom of the slide.